A very warm welcome here. I'm Patrick Leigh from the Parkside Studios here at BCU, bringing you Playback Music Memories. Well, today my two guests include faces that are well known around BCU media. I have Hilary Weston-Jones, the lecturer in professional and academic development, and Matt Grimes, the degree leader in music industries. So how are you both today?
Very well, thanks.
Yeah, good, thank you.
Good.
Slow walk to Christmas, is it? Or is it too early to talk about it?
I don't know what you're talking about.
Far too early then.
Don't do Christmas, sorry.
Too early.
I'll be in Thailand when that's going on.
Okie dokie then, yeah. So, well, we'll start off then with the early days of being into music. And Matt, with yourself, as your job title would suggest, someone from a musical background. What artists did you have as an influence that first got you into music, or what genres perhaps?
Wow, okay, so when I was about 7 years old, I grew up in a household where there was always music. We didn't have a television. My dad wasn't a big fan of TV, but he was a massive fan of music, as was my mum, and I think that was the very thing that sort of got them together, was their love of music. So from a very early age, music was in the house, and it was everything from classical. My dad was a big fan of classical. I think he'd like to think of himself as a bit of a snob. My mum was really into jazz. So we had a real variation of music, but my dad was also into folk music. My mum was really into blues music, so Rolling Stones, Beatles. Cannot abide the Beatles, unfortunately, because I've listened to too much of it as a youngster.
Bit force-fed were you?
Yeah, very much so. So always music. The very first record, so at the age of 7, I was given a record player, a Dansette record player. It's like a little box thing. Hilary probably remembers these things, yeah. And that was my mum and dad's old record player, and they upgraded to a radiogram, which was like this sort of massive sideboard
piece of furniture.
Absolutely, yeah. And they gave me this record player, and with it they gave me a record by Manfred Mann's Earth Band called The Mighty Quinn, and it was a song about an Eskimo. Yeah. I'm sure it was allegorical for something else that at the age of 7 I probably wasn't over familiar with. That was the very first record I owned. I still have that record now. It was on the Decca label. That's how much I remember about it. I haven't played it for many years, but I kept that. I kept that all through my teenage years, all through my youth. So that was my first real introduction to music, where I got to, and from that I then started to choose my own music. And when I was younger, I made some pretty crap choices. But you know, when you're
don't we all
8 or 9 years old, you're listening to pop music. So stuff like Slade and Gary Glitter, probably not the best thing to like nowadays. Not the Bay City Rollers.
I was massive Bay City Rollers fan.
I thought we might come on to that. And then, so my music tastes have changed over the years, but I was always very much at the forefront of buying my own music from quite an early age. It was really important for me to have that relationship with music. But without overtaking the whole conversation, I think Hilary will probably have some really interesting stuff to say about her musical journey as well.
Yes, Hilary, do you have similar sort of tastes? Or
very similar in that when I grew up, there was it was always music, and similar, a lot of classical music. My dad was a vicar, so a lot of church music. And again, the Beatles, Simon and Garfunkel, you know, the kind of stuff that my mum would like, the Carpenters.
Yeah. Safe music.
Yeah. And then sort of a bit following on from my big sister, who was into Genesis and Elton John, so I was exposed to that. And then I was a massive Bay City Rollers fan. And again, my first record I bought myself was the Rubettes Jukebox Jive.
Wow, great record too.
Yeah.
Glam rock, isn't it? I think mid-70s.
Yeah, it was glam rock, I suppose. Yeah.
And again, then started to make my own choices, and a lot of that was listening to Radio 1.
Yeah. Instrumental, really, wasn't it?
Yeah.
In our youth.
And I think being exposed to music from the past, so yes, the Beatles, it was that, but you know, that's how I discovered the Rolling Stones, because you heard it on Radio 1.
I think that's quite interesting, because considering now maybe the audience will be listening to this be a younger audience, music is ubiquitous. I mean, it's literally everywhere, isn't it? You know. Yeah. But when we were younger, it was Radio 1.
Yeah, and you had to go and find
Top
it.
of the Pops.
And
that was about it.
Yeah,
that really was about it.
And I think, and Top of the Pops was massive. Top of the Pops was, you know, we will all remember the first time we saw Boy George on Top of the Pops, and I remember going to sixth form college and saying, "What on earth was that? That was amazing." Yeah. You know.
Yeah, because up to that point we only heard music.
Yes.
And suddenly we saw our pop stars that we loved on television.
And I think that also, you know, we're both sort of lusting after the turntable.
All the technology here in the studio,
and I hate technology. I hate Spotify because when I was growing up, music was an investment. You saved up. My first album was Wings at the Speed of Sound.
Right, okay.
I saved up. You had Our Price Records.
I remember Our Price.
Yeah, you had
still around in the late 80s.
Woolworths when I was a bit young, is it?
Yeah, Woolworths,
Yeah.
Woolworths, Our Price. They used to sell cheap boxes of singles
Yeah,
in
that's
the,
right.
in
Yeah,
the
yeah,
newsagents.
yeah.
So
Wow.
you saved up, and also I think what was important was that you listened to music as the musicians had put it together, their choices of an album, rather than dipping in and out. And it was a shared experience. You went round to your mate's house and listened to Dark Side of the Moon, or they would, Hunky Dory, or somebody would just say, it felt like you were a sponge and people were just saying, listen to this, listen to that.
Yeah, it was a communal experience, definitely. It's definitely something you shared. I remember when I first got into punk rock, so punk's always been the major influence in my musical life, and it still is now. And I remember distinctly hearing Sex Pistols, Never Mind the Bollocks, which is the first, at a mate's house, and just being absolutely blown away by it. And then, like, I saved up my money, bought the record, brought it home, played it really, really loud on my shoddy record player, thinking the swearing in it would really upset my parents, but it didn't. So it was a bit crap because
they quite liked it then. So.
Yeah. To be fair, my dad really did like punk rock. He could really relate to that. I was surprised because it was my mum that was really into the sort of raw sort of blues stuff, like the Stones and Amen Corner and the Faces and that, real sort of raw white blues. She wasn't that keen on punk rock. My dad really seemed to embrace it, as he did with a lot of the music. I mean, maybe he did it just so I didn't feel like I was rebelling. Maybe he did it just to spoil my fun. But no, I mean, and the great thing with music is that my parents and I, it's always been, and my sister, I've got two sisters. And back to what Hilary was saying, it was really a communal sort of thing. We would sit as a family, not sit there and do nothing and listen to music, but music would always be on where we were doing things together as a family. A lot of families now will sit down in front of the telly and not say a word to each other for 2 or 3 hours.
It's a shame, isn't it? Something like that has really been lost with that.
Yeah, I mean,
music
everything
in the
has
centre of the lounge, and
I think everything has its place, but as a family, we would do stuff together, and music would be the soundtrack to the stuff that we would
and
do
long
together.
journeys, driving from North London to Wales every year for your holiday. And again, it would be the argument, Dad, can we have Radio 1 on? And he'd give in, and then and then there will be a song that there was an Eric I Shot the Sheriff. He loved that, and that would be his, and that became the holiday song. And that sort of creating memories.
Yeah, or I remember me and my sisters arguing in the back about whose turn it was to have something on the radio.
And I think.
Or the cassette player that was in the car.
I think the 70s were possibly one of the best decades. I'm so grateful I grew up in the 70s with music, because...
Different genres, do you think?
Exactly. So there's very little music that I would say that I don't like. So I was into punk. I didn't go and see that many bands. I kind of felt I was a little bit just too young for it. I felt it was happening. It was down the road from me. I saw the UK Subs. And
great band.
Yeah, saw them at the...
Still gigging now. The lead singer, Charlie Harper's 80 years old. And he's still gigging. Fantastic.
And I think that, like Matt says, I think that influence of punk spread out so much, and I would look at it even into my TV career when I started working in the early days of Channel 4, and you could do whatever you wanted.
It was an attitude, wasn't it?
And I think when I look back at the people that I was working with, they were all punks, and they all. It was an amazing that legacy. But I think in the 70s, I loved disco.
Yeah, that was at a similar time as well, wasn't it?
I was thinking this morning when I was a student in the late 80s, in the halls of residence at Birmingham Poly, the music that was coming out of my bedroom was not the Smiths and the Cure. I was listening to Aretha Franklin, Billie Holiday. It was, and I think from the 70s, it exposed you to all those different. I love a good pop song.
Yeah.
I think you just had exposure to all of that.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's quite interesting what you said about, you were grateful to grow up in the 70s. I mean, I'm always slightly, I'm not dismissing what you're saying, because it is very much an individual thing. But I think there's this idea that, older people go, well, music was so much better then, or there was so much variety then, or whatever. And I think that every generation has its music.
Yeah.
And I think that's really, really important. I mean, there's some fantastic music coming out now. that's only been enabled by the development of things like technology that we wouldn't have got in the 70s because that technology wasn't there. So they couldn't physically make the sort of music we're listening to now.
Different situation, isn't it, entirely? So
yeah,
you can't really compare like for like in many ways,
Yeah.
can you? Because of the technology factor.
Absolutely. And I think what Hilary was saying about the 70s, we generally tend to bookend generations or decades by saying the 70s was... And punk stands out at the end of the 70s, prog rock in the middle of the 70s. But actually, we do forget a whole lot of stuff around things like disco.
Yeah.
There was some amazing reggae music coming out of Jamaica in the 70s,
Yeah.
fantastic dub reggae that I did get to hear about because I used to go to some of the blues parties. But, a whole generation of white listeners would never have got to hear that music because, one, it was never on the radio because it was predominantly white radio. And secondly, it was a whole culture that was pretty much closed off to us. So there was some fantastic music that was coming out that we just never got to hear about. So I'm always slightly suspicious when there's this thing of the 70s was great but there was so much stuff that we didn't hear. And now I'm listening to music like grime and trap and stuff, and I'm thinking, wow, God, I wish I was 30 years younger and listening to this sort of music now because, well, I mean, I can still listen to it, but...
In terms of really appreciating it,
well,
and
no, I think
yourself into
I can
it.
appreciate it. I think just in terms of getting involved in it, I can't see him as a 55-year-old turning up to work with a load of trap artists in a studio somewhere because they're going to look at me and go, well, an old white man, what do you know about this sort of stuff? And they'd have a point.
But you never know, though, do you?
You don't.
No, we were talking about David Rodigan yesterday in the office.
What a massive influence he was. So for those listeners who aren't familiar, David Rodigan had a show on London. Was it Radio London or London Radio? I don't know. One of the independent Capital. Before
was it Capital?
It preceded Capital, I think, but then he ended up working on Capital. Yeah. But anyway, David Rodigan's a white guy, but he was absolutely implicit in bringing Jamaican music to white listeners in London, certainly, and also
huge thing
eventually
that had been at the time.
and across. And John Peel picked up on that as well. I think partly influenced by David Rodigan's reach in the fact that when I was younger, you could listen to Capital Radio, and I was listening to reggae music, I was listening to calypso music, I was listening to Bhangra music when it was traditional Bhangra, music that was being played to the different ethnicities across the city. Outside of London, you probably didn't get that sort of radio coverage of those sorts of music. So I was quite lucky in that respect. Probably the same for you as well, living in London, that you got to hear lots of different music.
Yeah. Was that on different channels, did you say? Or was that more like just...
Well, there was the independent stuff like Caroline,
Radio
Caroline, and
Caroline.
Some of the pirate radio. So in the 70s, there was a station called the Dread Broadcasting Corporation that were based in North London, actually, not far from Edmonton, DBC. Then moved to Brixton. They were playing... it was a pirate radio station that played just reggae music. So there were a number of pirate radio stations and some of the independent ones. The BBC were just a bit rubbish at covering that sort of stuff.
Have you found over the years, well, this sort of applies to both of you, that you've got a certain, we said so much then about 70s music, punk music, disco music, that you've tried to almost search for similar bands as the decades have gone on, or for yourselves, is it more about the actual era that music represents rather than the actual genre or type of sound, should we say?
Oh, well, to me, music is all about the moment, the memories. You hear one song and it will literally make me burst into tears because it just takes me back.
So it's the whole nostalgia.
We all feel that way,
Massive Attack, Unfinished Symphony makes me think of being in my mate's flat in Bath, getting ready to go to Glastonbury, knowing it was going to be the best weekend we ever had, and playing it over and over and over again on a loop. And that will just reduce me to tears because it was such a happy time.
That's a very, very defined tune as well, isn't it?
I think... you see, unlike Mac, I don't really embrace new music anymore. I feel like my head's
guilty of that
full.
As well.
And
you need to chuck out some of the old and bring in some of the new. Genesis or old hat now. Get rid of it.
No, I'm not a Genesis
You're
fan.
over that now.
I mean, I think it is certain eras. So, looking back on it, in the 80s, when I was living in London, I rarely went to gigs. I listened to music all the time. I was with a group of friends. So in the sort of late 70s, early 80s, I went to a few. Saw the Police, I saw the Beat, UK subs. And then I had years where I think literally the only band I went to see was Wham. I was a massive Wham fan at Wembley. And just because the group of people I was with, we listened to music, we went clubbing.
Right, okay.
But we didn't go and see bands.
Yeah.
And then suddenly, in the late sort of 1989, I went to America on my own, met loads of people from the UK, came back. They were my core mates.
Yeah.
They were really into music. And so throughout the 90s, I probably went to a gig a week.
Yeah. It's funny though, isn't it, how that works? Because I mean, I can understand the sort of clubbing thing, because you reach an age where you think actually gigs, you want to be in a nightclub because there's something about the allure of nightclubs. And when you sort of reach, I mean, legally 18, but when you're sort of 16, 17, you're starting to go to nightclubs because you can, and there's something mysterious about it. And gigs seem to tail off, and then later on you realise that clubbing actually isn't all that brilliant.
Yeah, it's boring.
It's pretty
beat the live
routine.
experience.
Yeah.
You know.
And so I think
isn't it?
I discovered really getting into live music much later on in my life, and then I just embraced it. And living in North London, I was just off the Holloway Road. You know, you had Camden, you had Islington, you had
great venues down.
I was going to say, is that the sort of venues you went to?
The Town and Country,
the Rocket, down Holloway Road was a great venue.
And you know, the only time I ever went to
Seven Sisters Pub.
Yes,
At the top of Seven Sisters Road.
all the pubs as well.
Yeah.
National in Kilburn.
Yeah.
And I think it was a great time because I loved all the Britpop stuff, but it was Bjork, it was Beck, there was such great music. And then as well, being in London, seeing the classics. And so one of my examples I had one friend who I went with mostly, and when Johnny Cash died, I was watching a documentary about Johnny Cash with my husband, and we were saying, oh God, wouldn't it have been great to see Johnny Cash live? Then they showed clips of him at Glastonbury, and I was like, I was there. I rang up my mate,
you didn't realise
mate, and I told her this story, and she said, you silly cow, we saw him as well at the Royal Albert Hall.
Wow.
And so I think there was so much, I just fell into it, and that was my peak period. And I think being in London, you'd hear a band on the radio and they'd be playing down the road the next night, and that was great. But the 80s for me was just it is strange. There's lots of regrets about all the bands that I missed seeing.
Okay. I mean, I sort of get that. I mean, I used as a teenager and into my sort of early 20s, I would be going to gigs pretty much as well whenever I could. My money was spent on records and gigs and very little else. And then tail end of the 80s, the whole acid house thing kicked off. Yep. And then I'm going out to free parties in warehouses, in fields. I stopped going to gigs. I was going to see DJs play, you know, but not in clubs.
This sort of late 80s, you say?
Yeah, late 80s, early 90s, mostly illegal sort of gatherings and
cryptic clues of how to find these places and stuff.
Driving around the M25.
Yeah,
I've heard about
I
that.
sort of steered away from that sort of live performance thing. And to be honest with you, I've never really embraced the live thing as much as I did when I was younger, but I think a lot of that's just down to time, responsibilities, opportunities. You know, I live in a place where there is no live music, so I have to travel to it, and that's always problematic if you want to get a train home. So I see probably less live music now than I used to.
Because of circumstances.
Yeah, mostly. But I still make a point of going out when I can, and I generally tend to. I'm not a big fan of nostalgia. There's lots of the old punk bands that are still gigging. I feel a bit weird about seeing a 55-year-old guy on stage trying to be 30 again or 20 again. It just looks a bit weird.
It can be a bit
with a double chin and all that sort of thing.
Yeah,
and like, you know,
sacrifice their legend. What you remember them when they're in their
and shouting about anarchy and fighting the system, and it's like, you're going to go home to your hot chocolate tonight and all that sort of thing. So I find that a little bit uncomfortable. So there's a big thing for nostalgia. There's a massive punk festival up in Blackpool. Happens every year and has done for the last 10 or 15 years, called Rebellion. I've never been, because for me, I don't want to go and see bands from my youth banging out songs that I was listening to 30 years ago. I would rather go to Bristol or to Birmingham here and go and see some brand new underground punk band that I've never seen before, that actually seem to be embracing a new manifestation of what punk is.
And how it's evolved as well.
Yeah, you know, and punk's punk. You know, it hasn't changed a great deal. But
I'm still getting it then, punk then. So
yeah, but I think there's something about seeing new bands rather than seeing, you know, no disrespect to Charlie Harper, the UK Subs are a great band, but I don't want to go and see an 8-year-old singing songs up when I was 15. You know, it just doesn't wash with me. I want something new, exciting, and I think grime music. I'm really into grime music because I think it's so much like punk rock. It's early beginnings of punk rock. It's kids that don't have access to all of those sort of things like recording studios and whatever, and they're just going out there and doing their own thing. It's all DIY. Really 2 fingers up at the whole record industry.
It's good sort of rawness about it. That
yeah,
you like
and getting on with it and just doing it. Yeah, there's no sort of filter there, which to me is fantastic. But yeah, I think it's a weird thing, the nostalgia thing, because we're here talking about music memories, and there was a lot of money being made in nostalgia in the music industry. Reissues of albums, bands going back on tour, reforming. Because they didn't make provisions for their pensions when they were younger. They were sticking most of their money up their noses and stuff. So suddenly now they're getting to 60 and going, shit, I've got no money. And they're going out on the road again. And there's a market for it because people of Hilary and I's age have got money to spend. And we'll pay 40 quid to go and see somebody that played in our 20s.
Yeah.
And,
it's a numbers game, isn't it?
Yeah, and get all those feelings coming back about, remembering what it was like when I heard that song 20 years ago, who I was with and what I was doing. And we'll pay for that privilege, So there is it's a big money maker in it.
We're talking about obviously gigs we were going on about then, and where you used to both hang out. Well, Matt, yourself, along with Hilary, a fellow Londoner, but I understand as a youngster you moved to Brighton.
I did,
when you were very young. Did you find that it was actually in Brighton that you were going to a lot of venues, or did you see yourself sort of heading more up the A23 and back into the capital?
Both, to be fair. So certainly in the sort of early 80s I got involved in the whole of narco-punk, DIY punk scene. So a lot of the gigs I would go and see weren't conventional gigs in so much as I would see gigs in Brighton, some I'd pay for, some were done in squats, or they were just done in abandoned buildings. And then I'd also go up to London. So there'd be this whole sort of scene where you would travel around, you jump in someone's car or you jump a train and not pay for it and go. So I'd be going back and forth to London and Bristol, Portsmouth. So where there were these punk scenes, I would be travelling back and forth to seeing bands there. And most of them, I say, were unconventional. I wasn't paying to go and see a band in a pub or a venue. It really was, there was like a load of really big squats in London in the late 70s, early 80s that would put on events, put on bands and stuff. And the bands would play for free and you go and see it for free. And so that was really where I got involved in that whole DIY punk thing, which was then got me my early work in the music industries, working as a roadie and then as a sound engineer and then as a tour manager, mostly for DIY punk bands where there's absolutely no money in it. I travel with bands across Europe, playing in squats there, sleeping on dirty mattresses on floors of people's squats in Leiden in Holland and Barcelona and wherever. So there was something about that. So for me it was the geography of the place wasn't the important thing. It was more about just getting out there and going and seeing bands, So London was as appealing as Brighton.
Well, staying on the subject of Brighton and skiing off piste a little bit now, you'd have been there, I believe, then during the Quadrophenia era, which incidentally is 40 years old this year.
Okay, well, the original Quadrophenia album came out in 1973, 74.
Was it 73?
Yeah.
Was it the original?
Something like that. But there was that whole mod revival.
Yeah.
In the
79,
80s.
wasn't it?
Yeah, in 79.
Yeah.
And here's a weird thing. So I was heavily into punk. A lot of my mates were these new mods.
Yeah.
And I actually remember queuing with them all night outside the Brighton Centre in 1980, maybe 81, to get a ticket to see the who were going to be performing Quadrophenia, because they filmed Quadrophenia in Brighton. The film that came out in the 70s, they filmed it in Brighton, and a few of my mates were in that film.
What extras?
As extras and stuff, yeah. I'd like to have been, but I wasn't because I had a mohawk. It probably wouldn't have been very reflective of that period. But we all queued, together, camped out overnight, hundreds of people to get tickets for this gig. And I went to see the Who, and they were fantastic, absolutely amazing live band.
Did the film do a lot of? Obviously Brighton itself would have got a lot of publicity, of course, wouldn't it, from it? But did it help a lot of up and coming bands as well? Do you think indirectly publicity? From
not necessarily from Brighton itself. There were a couple of mod bands that came out of Brighton, but I think the whole mod revival thing, like most things that are revival, they have a period of time where they're popular. So there were a number of bands around, like the Jam. Secret Affair, God, yeah.
Yeah,
so there were a number of these sort of mod revival bands, and it was of a time and a place. They made the film Quadrophenia based on the album that the Who released in the early 1970s, which was a story about what's his name? He's the guitarist from the Who.
Oh, goodness me, we've all forgotten. Yeah, that man. Yeah.
About his experience of being a mod in the 60s. Well, the whole band really. And then it was a sort of opera thing. Then it was turned into a film, which was then filmed in Brighton. And at that point, there was that whole sort of mod revival came off the back of that.
But I think something like Quadrophenia, again, I think that opened up, certainly me, to the music of The Who that I'd sort of gone past. So I loved the film, went to see the film, and it got me into the music. And I think similar at the same time with the whole two-tone thing, which I absolutely loved.
The specials and
the specials, you know, and you know that whole thing, you know, being at school was great.
Yeah,
everybody was in, and I especially think being in North London, it was probably the same being in Coventry, but certainly North London with Madness up there, you know, and all of that, you just felt part of something, and that introduced me to a lot of sort of ska.
Me
so
too.
I think you know those revivals, as you say, that sort of short period of time, but they opened up the doors to you know, exploring different genres.
And I think what's interesting, I remember when I was at secondary school, there were the tribes.
Yeah.
You know, there were skinheads, mods,
suede heads,
two-toners, punks, rockers. I mean, casuals.
Yes,
We were into soul and stuff.
And I remember you'd come back after the school holiday, and so Gary Watts had turned from a skinhead to a suede head over the school holiday, and it's, you know.
But there would always be these sort of like various subcultures and these various sort of standoffs at school. You'd hang around in your gang, your tribe, and after school, when you'd get outside the school gates, you'd end up rocking with each other.
Yeah.
You know, the amount of times I remember getting beaten up on the way home from school, I couldn't count. You know, pretty much every other day. But that was it. There were interesting times because there was loads of things going on, and whilst there were these individual tribes, there was a lot of crossovers. So, as I say, you know, I mean, Hilary's right. Those revivals really introduced me to a lot of the music my mum and dad were listening to that I'd sort of dismissed. So things like the Small Faces and the Who. You know, my mum and dad listened to that when I was a kid, and I was aware of it, but I never really paid it much attention.
But then it had a rebirth.
Well, because I mean, as soon as punk came out, that was my way of saying to my mum and dad, "Your music's shit, and I'm going to listen to this." So I dismissed all of that, and then the whole mod thing brought that 60s thing, and it brought back the whole psychedelic thing as well. And suddenly I'm listening to Jimi Hendrix and stuff like that, and it's like, wow, actually, there is a place for that sort of thing.
And I think politics played a big part in that as well.
Huge.
So, you know, the whole two-tone movement against the sort of the white racist skinhead movement.
Yeah, definitely.
And you know, I remember at our school in North London, we had the junior, the National Front, the junior head of the National Front went to my school.
Wow.
And so we used to have news, so there was always fights outside, and you know, we used to have news teams out there, but we were very politically aware, I think, at quite a young age, and I think a lot of that for me came through the music that I was listening to.
I would totally agree with that, and this is not a disparaging comment on young people today, because I think they are now starting to wake up to the importance of politics. I know with my own kids, certainly during the 90s, they were quite apolitical. Now, as they got into their late 20s, early 30s, they are now very, very, very politically active, all three of them, which is great. But yeah, as a youngster, I remember politics was always at the forefront. Music was,
you know, you had rock against racism. You know,
and the whole two-tone thing, and you know, the thing with the miners as well, the Red Wedge tour.
You know,
I was going to say, where did that come? That was a few years later, wasn't it? Sort of mid-80s, wasn't it?
I mean, the whole the miners' strike thing was 84, 85, but then you also had the thing with the New Age Travellers and the authorities coming down them in 86, which I was also involved in as well. So there was lots of political things where music played a soundtrack. And we can see that right back to the era of rock and roll and civil rights in the 60s, and then certainly through the 70s and 80s. As we got into the 90s, the whole rave thing was a bit more sort of hedonistic.
Yes.
It became less political and more just about going out and having
politics
fun.
for that, was there really? So,
well, there was, but it wasn't so popularised. So certainly with the people I used to hang around with when it was all the sort of like illegal raves, the free party thing, that was very much a culture of resistance against sort of the authorities, because they were doing things outside of the legal framework. But I would, and then there's a whole sort of like Reclaim the Streets came out off the back of the whole rave movement. So it did become political, especially when they started to bring in things like Criminal Justice Act, which prevented people from having these gatherings. The whole rave thing then became very political, which was really, really important. And then it just seemed to tail off again.
Quite reactionary, maybe as well.
But I think things like grime has really brought politics back into the musical mix again, and I think that's really, really important. for young people to be able to align themselves. And we saw that a few years ago with students protesting outside Parliament, and I think it was not Stormzy, it was one of
He sang at Glastonbury, didn't he, last year?
One of the grime artists. Their song became a bit of a soundtrack for those protests. So I think that's great now that it is becoming more political again.
Well, back to gigs. You've sort of touched on, obviously, the different subcultures and cultures, and as you say, where there was a crossover and things like that. Probably a bit of an obvious question here, but are there any really sort of vivid items of clothes that either of you used to wear when you went to any of these gigs, or not just gigs, but just vivid musical items that you still dig out now and then?
I still have got my leather jacket that I bought in Kensington Market, I think in 1989, and that went everywhere with me. Always worn black. And a friend used to go to a lot of games with one of my friends, and we used to get a bit panicky down the it'd have to be an amazing gig to get us right there. But what we used to do is, rather than looking sad standing at the back, we used to put sunglasses on, stand at the back and pretend to be music journalists. And I remember being at the ICA, that's the most pretentious, being at the ICA seeing
fantastic.
Grantley Buffalo or something, and me and Sarah standing there, leather jacket, red lipstick, it was always red lipstick, and black sunglasses.
And you just sort of like nodding a bit. Right?
Yeah. And then suddenly we'd be doing that, and then suddenly something we loved would come on, and we'd just forget about, our fears and run down the front and start jumping up and down. So it was, and I've still got my leather jacket, and it's still got I've got a not a dollar, I've got a dime or something from when I first went to America, and I took my leather jacket with me, and I've still got a dime or something in my pocket.
So very similar to Hilary, I've still got my punk leather jacket, which covered in studs, patches, favourite bands painted all over it. And I've always kept that, and there have been times I've come very close to losing it, but I've always managed to hang on to it.
A friend of mine's got still got his leather jacket, and he was a massive Motorhead fan, and so he spent ages with the studs putting Motorhead on the back of his leather jacket, but he missed out the T, so it said Moorhead.
That could be an invitation, couldn't it?
And I've still got all of my tickets.
Yes, I've kept a lot of my tickets. I've got some fanzines that I produced and I bought or got given in the so loads of punk fanzines or zines that I've got, and I've got some old festival programs that I've got, loads of rave flyers that I kept hold of.
Old shoe boxes under beds.
All
kept there and hoarded.
I used to frame. I've still got frames.
Have you now?
It's been the early 90s. I've got frames of tickets of bands I saw. So it's the Wonder Stuff. It's Carter. And I've got those. And then I have got ages ago a photo album to put them all in.
Wow.
And I've never done it.
You should do.
I should, because my mate's done it, and it's just brilliant because you go through and you
memories
just go,
again. It's that, again, that whole nostalgia thing.
But it's also it's just the design as well, the logo.
Yeah.
Of you'll see something and it just.
I suppose one of my biggest, not regrets, because it was completely out of my hands, but I had a whole collection of photographs from my youth, from 14 to probably my mid to late 20s, so into the early 90s, and I lost a whole lot in a fire.
Oh no!
Every single. This was before digital cameras.
Yeah.
And,
long before, wouldn't it?
So, every single photographic memory of my youth.
Oh God.
Gone. So I've had to rely on other mates, in the past I've scanned various things, but and I've really, still to this day, really upsets me. But it was just one of those unfortunate things that got involved in a fire and the whole lot went.
They do say though,
I'm alive, so that's the main thing.
Yeah,
that's it. I mean, that's when you put these things in perspective. But they do say though, don't they, that the best memories are actually the ones that are in your mind, if that's any consolation.
Yeah, I suppose so. But I think having those things that stimulate those memories is important. The physical artifacts. So. Our good friend Jez runs the Birmingham Music Archive, and whilst I was not involved in music in Birmingham, I came to a few gigs here. Actually, I came to see Crass here a couple of times down at the Digbeth Institute. It was called then, and there's some stuff up on that Jez's website. And I look at there's a photograph of the band of Crass on stage at the Digbeth. God, I was at that gig. I travelled all the way up from Brighton for that. It was 1981, so I was 16, 17. I hitchhiked all the way up. And those things bring back memories. I've got no evidence of that now because the whole lot went up in flames. But so I think the idea of having those physical artifacts and people archiving those is really important for people to attach or stimulate those memories, but also just for younger people to look back and say, this is how music has developed, or not, depending on what you're taking.
It's a nice timepiece, isn't it? Yeah.
It is, yeah.
Well, technology, we were talking about that earlier on, but how it's evolved and, different artists. I mean, it's second nature to it all, isn't it now, whether it's streaming, downloading, or just listening to stuff on YouTube. But we've seen as well that vinyls have made a big comeback, haven't they, particularly in the past decade. Have either of you embraced to sort of digging out the old 33s and 45s again?
I've still got all my vinyl. I've still got all my cassettes. And there was an article 2 weeks ago that cassettes are coming back.
They are. And in fact, there's a real problem now because there's a lack of suppliers and manufacturers.
And I've still got my Walkman, and I'm determined to get my batteries back in and listen to my mixtapes and what have you. So I haven't got a record player at the moment. I haven't got a turntable at the moment, but I am getting one because I find with streaming, I never know what to listen to because you'll say, my mind just can't understand Spotify. Me and my husband will always play the same things because I need to be able to look at my vinyl and all my and I've kept all my CDs as well because I don't trust technology, and when it all crashes and it all comes tumbling down, I will still have my CDs, my tapes, everything.
Do you know if they're about 10 or 12 years old now, they're rubbish?
What, your CDs?
They deteriorate. The quality deteriorates. So people think they're a permanent thing, but they don't actually.
Yeah. But vinyl is still my favourite thing.
Yeah.
And
mine too.
And I just find Spotify blows my mind because I just can't. My imagine. I'll suddenly think. I thought the other day, I've not listened to any Style Council for years, and I've always been a Paul Weller fan from the Jam all the way through to his single solo stuff in the 90s, and I've seen him loads of times. But I thought I always miss out that. But I would never think that when somebody says, "Oh, put Spotify on," and my mind goes blank, and I hate that. And I like the physicality of an album. I want to know who designed the sleeve. I want a sleeve design. I want to know who designed it and why. I want the lyrics. I want to know who played on it. I want to listen to it in the order that if you think of Dark Side of the Moon, you can't mess around.
No,
with
if you play it back to front,
that's the trouble with clicking on iTunes and stuff. Isn't it?
I mean, to be fair, it sounded rubbish the right way around, but it sounds even more rubbish the second way.
I love Dark Side of the Moon.
Controversial.
Well,
yeah.
But don't get me wrong, I do like Pink Floyd, but I think at the point Syd Barrett left, that was when they started to fall apart.
That's when you,
I was very much more into the sort of psychedelic stuff they did. I mean, for me, vinyl, I do use Spotify because I think they're great for finding new music. And I'll just put it on some random playlist, or I might just type into the search engine grime, and it will just provide a load of music, or I might go, Iranian hip hop, and it will provide some whatever. So I think it's quite good for that. I mean, I've still got. Well, here's an interesting thing about my vinyl collection. I've got probably about 600 or 700 records at home. Some out that I play regularly, some in boxes up in the attic because there just isn't space to put them out. My partner doesn't want them all over the house. But I've sold my record collection twice and rebought it.
Really?
Wow, how come?
Yeah. Well, so the first time round, I needed to get out of Brighton. I was living in a squat. I had a great record collection, which was quite difficult to move around. And my parents, God bless them, who lived in Brighton, kept hold of most of it. And I decided I wanted to leave Brighton, and I was going to go and join the Travellers, so I had to go and buy a truck. So I sold my record collection to a record store in Brighton, got the money together, went out and bought a truck, and then went and lived on the road. And then later on, as I moved back into what I call settled life with my kids, I then started to buy my record collection back.
Yeah.
When you had more of a position to
when I had
a bit more time in your hands and space
and some money to do that.
Of course.
Then for another reason which I won't divulge, I had to sell my record collection again to fund something else. And I'm slowly in the process of buying all that back again. But some of them I sold to friends of mine with the provision that I will buy those back off you at some point. And
it's like a loan
and
then.
And they've honoured that. They've been very true. They were. They were sort of like
good.
custodians more than anything else. But the trouble now about buying some of the records back that I had then, there was a core collection that I always kept because I just thought I'm never going to get rid of these. They were mostly my anarcho-punk records. But then trying to buy some of these other records back now, I mean, of course, the value of them has just gone up exponentially. It's just, so I sold that for £2 in 1983 or 1984, and now it's going to cost me 25 quid to buy it back, sort of thing. Do you know what I mean? So
you could only do what was right at the time. Though,
well, I had
can't you?
to. It was a
needs must, isn't it?
It was exactly that. I needed to get away from what I was doing, and the only way I could raise that sort of money, because my parents are poor working class people, they couldn't lend me the money. I had to sell my records. So, but they're still there. They're coming back in dribs and drabs, and it's quite nice actually going to find them again, because it's reminding me of other records. I did keep a list. Here's the thing: I literally wrote every single one down. So I thought I need to go back and buy it, because I always knew when I sold them I would be buying them back at some point. And of course, that list ended up getting burnt with all those photographs.
I have to try and remember it all. Try and
it's all my memory.
It's all my memory. So well, I mean, we'll finish off nicely then. We're obviously just talking on the subject then of vinyls. I mean, artwork was always part of the attraction. I think Hilary touched on it earlier on with vinyl record sleeves, and with young people. I mean, it seems to be almost like more and more bohemian as one year ends to another. Do you feel there'll ever be enough of a demand for vinyls to make a complete comeback, and therefore see like the rebirth of the good old traditional record shops again?
Okay, so HMV have just opened the biggest record store in Europe. In Birmingham recently.
Canadian, the Vault,
Canadian guy, and it's stocked with records. So I think there is a demand for it. How long that demand will last for, I don't know. I don't think vinyl will ever replace digital or streaming.
No,
because digital or streaming brings a level of convenience. I can be on the train, coming to work, listening to music on Spotify, or listening to music that I've downloaded onto my phone from my own record collection, which I can't do with vinyl. I think vinyl, there is something about vinyl. Young people are getting into it. I think they do appreciate the quality of sound you'll get from vinyl compared to an MP3 or a digital stream. I don't think it will replace it. I think it will reach a saturation point as such that it will. I mean, cassettes is now on the way back. So
I'm just
they become. I think it's cyclical, and I think it's based on trends and But I don't think vinyl will ever go away. It never has.
No, it hasn't gone away.
I'm not sure it will ever hold the same position it did, because it has been superseded by something that is far more convenient and far more easier for people to engage with than buying a piece of plastic.
You can play obviously hundreds of songs in one, on one list, can't you? With technology, but that's what I can't understand about cassettes. Because you're talking about obviously the convenience side of it.
Absolutely awful format. Why it would come back, I don't know. It's absolutely crap.
I'm just thinking of young people as well. Obviously, with everyone being so sort of time obsessed now, the whole sort of running it backwards, running it forward, just to get to that right place, whilst also degrading the tape.
That's the thing. After 30 rewinds, you've stretched it. It's useless.
I can't see that go. I mean, just trying to imagine someone of about like 15, 16 now, sort of getting a biro out and trying to run the tape on like we would have done.
I was into cassettes as a youngster because it meant that I didn't have to buy records. It was a cheap alternative to buying records. You could record stuff off the radio. So I used to religiously listen to John Peel every night with my tape recorder there, the little transistor radio next to the tape recorder, with my finger on the record button, waiting for him to stop speaking and for the song to start, and push the record. And he was very good because he never talked over the records, whereas other DJs would, because they knew that people were recording them at home.
I remember sitting there with recording off top of the pops.
Wow, off the telly.
With them, and what I used to do, so it's your little box recorder, you press your two buttons and you go that. And if it was a song that my sister liked, I'd wait right to the very end and then I'd cough.
Oh, that's cruel.
Oh, dear me.
Cruel. I mean, I think certainly within the anarcho-punk circles that I'm mixing, taping was the thing. It was a cheap way for bands to get their music out there. So you didn't need a studio. You didn't need that. All you needed was a tape recorder and a room, and people would record it, and then you'd be tape trading at gigs, swapping tapes. You do mail order, distro, and it was a great way of circumnavigating the music industries who had like whole sort of gatekeeping and filtered processes in the way. So anarcho-punk would never have got as popular or as distributed as widely if it wasn't for cassettes. But, and I've got boxes and boxes of cassettes of all these old anarcho-punk gigs I recorded, or bands that brought out stuff on cassette, or you got free with a fan scene. But I wouldn't play them now. I'd probably play them once and digitise them, because the quality of them would have degraded now, and I've seen this with archiving practices where people get a tape of something and they go, right, we need to digitise it. You get one hit, because if you do it, because the trouble with tape is it picks up so much crap, because it's magnetic. And you play it once, it just strips the audio off it, so it is really a one hit sort of thing. So
yeah, not the greatest quality, but
It's
then
not,
still
you
a
know.
nostalgia hit, isn't it, for some people?
yeah,
But
I mean, again, I think for young people now, they just want something
Curiosity.
physical. Well, I think
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
want something
Yeah.
physical. I think
That's what
what's
you were
missing with the whole digital thing is people don't have something tangible, something they can hold, something they can relate to, something that is there in front of them. It makes it real.
And I think it reflects you. So when we're going back to sort of, sort of late 70s, early 80s, where it was tribes, you're walking down the road with an album underneath your sleeve. You're sending out a message.
You are, absolutely.
And-
A message that come and beat me up.
Yeah,
I like
exactly. or, and I can't remember who was it. Was it the
that?
Rolling Stones that they met because Mick Jagger was sitting on a train with some albums underneath his arm, and Ronnie Wood saw him or something, and that's how they got talking. And I just think that you'd always make it think, I'll have that album out on display.
Yeah.
You know, so
it's
Well, here's the
not quite
thing.
the same with a mobile phone, is it?
Yeah.
So-
So here's the thing. My record collection at the moment is I would argue is my pension. Though if I can manage to stay in this job long enough, I'll have a half decent pension to live off. But it's like my legacy to my kids. I've got something to hand over to my kids, and they'll probably fight over it, who gets what. But I won't be around, so I won't care. But the point being is, young people now, what musical legacy have they got to pass on to their kids? Because everything they listen to is on a stream.
Yeah.
And it's on a mobile
or an MP3 or whatever.
Yeah.
So you've got nothing to say to your kids. This is a bit of me.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. See, my equivalent of my vinyl, although I haven't, but it's the same with books. I'm obsessive about my books.
Right, okay, I'm less so.
And English degree. And they're all in alphabetical order.
Wow.
And
Jeez.
and I know if people have messed around with them because I love to look at them.
Okay.
And I do say that's going to be passed. That will be my legacy. I want people to come and pick out a book.
Well, music
was-
and literature. I mean, what better things to
I
pass
was going
on?
to say, there's a lot
Do
of
you know what I mean?
parallels, isn't there? So,
You know.
well, it's absolutely wonderful stories we've been catching up on there today. We're going to have to sort of wrap up and everything now. Amazing memories as well, and really interesting opinions we have
Thank you.
here. So,
Thank you.
It's been really enjoyable.
Yeah.
thoroughly enjoyable indeed.
Yeah.
Well, that's it for the day here at Parkside Studios. A special thanks again to Hilary and Matt for their contributions in all this. So do tune in again next time to more Playback Music Memories.
Keep it punk, kids.